Welcome. Welcome to the Administering Adds, Drops, and Withdrawals. So let's just jump into it right away, okay? Let's see what I mean by administering add, drops, and withdrawals by first taking a look at the agenda. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about are add, drops, and Pell recalculation overview, and you'll know what I mean by that in just a little bit and why that's significant. I'm going to talk about also, I'm going to have an entire section about administering Pell recalculation for modules, and this is much more detailed than I think any of you have ever heard before in the past, so I hope that we'll be able to clarify any questions or issues you may have in that regard. Also, how do adds and drops, adding and dropping courses, affect direct loans and their Title IV eligibility? Also, withdrawal. Then I'm going to go into the withdrawal portion, and a big part of this really deals with schools that are not required to take attendance, although I do indeed, of course, as it says here, talk about schools that are required to take attendance and the differences between the two. But obviously, where schools are getting hit the most are those who are not required to take attendance and having a consistent withdrawal date. And so I'm going to go over that in great detail as well. And of course, I think that since we're talking about adds, drops, and withdrawals, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't at least on some level talk at least just a little bit, and it will indeed be just a little bit, about enrollment reporting reminders. If you really came here for the enrollment reporting, I actually think you're in the wrong session. Session number 9 is probably a better session to attend to because that's where they really get into the nuts and bolts, okay? Okay, that said, let's indeed talk about this thing called adds, drops, and withdrawals. First I want to talk about is the add, drops, and Pell recalculation overview. And I want you to notice, a lot of you probably read the description. You said, oh goodness, they're going to talk about how I deal with census dates, right? And the thing about census dates, or you'll notice here I have census dates, freeze dates, some schools call it an add drop date. And I want you to notice that there's a very important reason as to why I will not use the term census date throughout this entire session, even though I know that probably 90% or more of you use that term in this room for this. And that's the fact that census date, as we get it, that for many of you, it's a date in which you're required to report enrollment statuses to your state or any other outside entity. And then when we replace the term Pell recalculation date with the word census date, we then start making all kinds of mistakes, such as, well, it's a census date, and that's when I determine what my student's enrollment status is for Title IV purposes, and that's not true. Let's be clear. The only type of Title IV aid that is affected by your census date, if you so choose to use that as your Pell recalculation date, is Pell, and that is it. That is it. There are some schools, because they've used the term census date, they forgot that that's what it was for. It was for the Pell recalculation date, and so they thought, well, that applies to all of my Title IV aid, and nothing could be further from the truth. So the only thing that your census date is used for is for Pell recalculation. Let's get that clear up front. Okay? Let it sink in. Go back to your office and make sure you adjust your policy. Okay? And that's why I'm not going to be using the term census date, freeze date, what you call an add drop date, because those have different definitions, and it takes us away from the real meaning of what we're here for. Okay? Is that too close? It's killing me. All right, that said, there are different options that you have when it comes to Pell recalculation. Now remember, Pell recalculation is an option. You don't have to have what we call a Pell recalculation date at your school or a Pell recalculation policy. So one of the options that's available to you is that you do not have a Pell recalculation policy. And I'm going to go over with you some things that will occur. What does it look like when I don't have a Pell recalculation policy? Maybe you want to reconsider that. You can also have a policy where a Pell recalculation occurs throughout the entire term every time a student adds or drops a class throughout the entire term. Now, there are some schools who are under the false impression that, well, that's what happens when I don't have a Pell recalculation policy, and that's not true either. You actually have to have a policy in place that says that that's exactly what you're going to do, and have fun with that, okay? Also, you can have a policy for a Pell recalculation based on enrollment status from a single fixed date. And I'll go over that with you and all the things that might you might run into, some of the unusual things that you might run into, such as withdrawals or late starts and things like that. Or, this is always fun, we can have a Pell policy for Pell recalculation to account for modules within the term, meaning the Pell recalculation date has a relationship with modules within a term. So I'll go over that in great detail, and that'll be a lot of fun, okay? Now, the good news is I'm going to have plenty of examples, and like I said, while there are a lot of you who will probably feel the need to ask questions again, hold on to those till the end of the session. And I've discovered that 90% of those who have questions, I end up answering them in subsequent slides. So it's all good. Hang in there. Now, let's talk about a school. What happens if I'm a school and I don't have a Pell recalculation policy? Okay. Now, again, if you don't have a Pell recalculation policy, I want you to notice what we've written here. Okay. The idea here is that if I don't have a Pell recalculation date established in accordance with my school's policy, a student who begins attendance in all classes would be paid based on the initial calculation. Now, the all classes thing, I'll get into a little bit more on what I mean by that. Now, the key here is even if his or her, we're going to use the initial calculation, even if his or her enrollment status changes before the disbursement is made. It's okay, I'll give you examples so we understand what that means. Now, this initial calculation definition, because, right, that's the key word. Well, what do you mean I have to use the initial calculation if I don't have a policy? How do you define that? Well, if you go into your FSA handbook, volume 3, for the chapter that talks about Pell, we give you this very lengthy definition of what we mean by an initial calculation. We give you the definition, but honestly, it wouldn't fit on the slide. So what I've done for your benefit is I've created a much shorter, in a nutshell, definition here for you. So let me read it out loud for you, and let's see it in action in the next few slides, okay? So you're able to flesh it out. Now, the initial calculation definition, okay, according to me, in a nutshell, is an initial calculation is the first calculation that is made on or after the date the school has received an ed-produced EFC and uses the enrollment status at the time of that initial calculation. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, let's go to Crystal Clear College and use them as an example and some of their students. All right, so they do not have a Pell recalculation policy. So here we have Ariel, who is a student at their school. They receive her Pell-eligible ISER on August the 5th of 2016, okay? And at that time, or it could be just a couple of days, depending upon when afterwards, but at the time when they do that initial calculation, they notice that she is scheduled to begin attendance as a full-time student at the start of the term on August the 15th, okay? So Ariel begins attendance as a full-time student, but then, look, after the term begins, which is August the 15th, do you see that? She drops 3 credit hours on August the 20th. Well, we have an initial Pell calculation of full-time status. So guess what? I get to use that initial Pell full-time status because she dropped that class after she began attendance in it. So I don't care when she dropped it. I don't care that it was just 5 days or 4 days after the fact that the term began. I get to go ahead and maintain full-time status for the student as opposed to 3/4 time, okay? That sounds wonderful, right? Why don't we all have no calculation policy? Don't have a policy for recalculation. Well, you'll see why in just a second. Now here I have, right, I have Ariel, same Ariel, but in this case, Ariel, they do indeed receive the ISER on August the 15th, and they provide an initial calculation showing that she is indeed scheduled to begin attendance as a half-time student, okay, on August the 15th. So good, I did the initial calculation. Here it is, she's enrolled half-time. So good, here's my initial calculation based on half-time status. But hold on, Ariel sees some classes that she wants to enroll in, and she enrolls in them just before the term even begins. I don't care if it was 3 days, 4 days, a week before the term began. But she adds 2 more classes, and before the term even begins, it appears as though Ariel is a full-time student. But what's my problem? My problem is I don't have a Pell recalculation date policy, a Pell recalculation policy. So what is the enrollment status that I have to use for Pell? That's right. because halftime is what my initial I don't care that I enrolled in them prior to the term start. My initial calculation said halftime because I don't have a policy that permits me to add those courses. I do not get to add them. So she is indeed only a halftime enrolled student. Okay? Let it sink in. I know this is shock for some of you, but okay. Now, let's continue on with the no Pell recalculation policy. Here I have Kevin, right? New student. Same thing. I receive an ISER on August the 5th, Pell eligible, and I provide initial calculation that he's scheduled to begin attendance as a full-time student, right? Great. I have an initial calculation as full-time. But what's my problem, right? My problem is that Kevin does not begin attendance. He does not begin attendance in 2 of the classes considered halftime at the term start. Now, this is the one instance because, right, one of the things I have to do when I award aid is, I don't care if your school that's not required to take attendance, that's not what I'm asking you to do, is that you have to make sure that your student does, though, begin attendance, right, for the classes for which they are receiving aid, for which they are enrolled in and for which they're intended to receive aid. Now, because he never began attendance in 2 of those classes, guess what? He's not eligible for those 2 classes. And so this is one time where I'm not going to take that initial calculation, and I do indeed have to do a recalculation for Kevin here. And so in this case, yeah, he's only going to get the halftime status enrollment, okay, for Pell. Good. That was fun. Let's talk about, now this is where it gets really simple, and some of you may roll your eyes, but let's talk about what happens if I do indeed have a single fixed Pell recalculation date, okay? And this is what this is going to go over with you here and what that might look like. And this is probably what the larger majority of you are used to, okay? So let's take a look at the setup first. Here I have Crystal Clear College. It has a fall term start of August the 15th. And of course, they now have a single fixed Pell recalculation date of August the 30th. All right. Now, sure, Sarah begins attendance on August the 15th with 6 credit hours. That's great. But she decides to add an additional course for 3 credit hours on August the 22nd. Is that before my Pell recalculation date? It is, because I have a policy I get to add those 3 credit hours. Yay. Not an initial calculation that I care about. So I do indeed get to include that 3 credit hours, and now Sarah is 3/4 times for receiving Pell, okay? Now Ben, he begins attendance on 8/15. Now it goes both ways. He starts off as a full-time student, right? But he does indeed drop 2 courses, 6, right, for a total of 6 credit hours prior to the Pell recalculation date again. So guess what? We don't get to include those classes that he dropped prior to the Pell recalculation date. I know this is not mind-blowing. This is something you've been doing for a while, I hope. So that's why he's only going to get halftime status for Pell, okay? Keep with me, all right? I know it's simple, but it gets better later. Now Gracie, same thing. Gracie begins on August the 15th with 6 credit hours, but she adds an additional 3 credit hours, but when? On September 1. Is that before or after my Pell recalculation date? It is indeed after, so I don't care, okay? Well, I do care. I love her. But FSA doesn't care, okay? We're not going to give you more money. Okay, so she still only gets 6 credit hours because she added that after the Pell recalculation date. But it goes the other way too. You look at Joshua here. Joshua, right, he was 12 credit hours before the Pell recalculation date, but after the Pell recalculation date drops, sure enough, he drops 2 courses for 6 credit hours, but thank you, Joshua, for doing that after my Pell recalculation date, because now I get to keep you as a full-time student and keep all of that wonderful Pell. Okay? Okay, that was the easy part. Now, one of the questions that I got a lot, and this is one of the first questions that I received in my own region that prompted me to really start asking, to determine that I had to really do this session, which is what do I do in the event that I have a student who withdraws? Now, hold on. My student actually drops all of their classes prior to my Pell recalculation date coming to fruition. So what do I do then? Does that mean they don't get any money? That doesn't make sense because R2T4 says that they've earned something, right? So this is what we say is when determining Pell eligibility, a school must use the enrollment status established on the earliest date of a withdrawal or PRD. In other words, whichever occurs first, whatever the enrollment status is, on whichever those two things occur first, that is the enrollment status that we use. So in other words, that first bullet is saying that if my student withdraws prior to my Pell recalculation date coming along, then I use the enrollment status that was established that the student was at the time of withdrawal. So I may have been full-time. I began attendance in all of my classes. I was full-time, but I withdrew maybe on day 5. So in that case, my student does indeed still get the Pell full-time. But of course, we're going to take it away. We earn it through attendance and to some degree. But that's the enrollment status that you use because the withdrawal date occurred prior to the Pell recalculation date. So I use the enrollment status at the time of withdrawal, okay? At the same time, let's say I have a student who maybe they are attending and they add a Pell recalculation date, they add a class after the Pell recalculation date, and then they withdraw. You see why now it's important that I use the earlier of the two because they still were in attendance up to the Pell recalculation date. So the Pell recalculation date in this case comes before the withdrawal date. So I'm going to use the Pell recalculation date in determining my student's enrollment status. So again, whichever occurs first, that's the one that I'm going to use. And that's a simple rule, okay, that you can basically live off of. So again, let's look at some examples here so that we make sure we understand it. And I have one here that is kind of fun. Now, Alyssa begins attendance, right, on August 15th with 6 credit hours, but withdraws on August the 22nd. So, right, we look at what happened first. Did she withdraw prior to her Pell recalculation date of August the 30th? She did indeed. And so I'm going to take the enrollment status at the time of withdrawal. So it's going to be 6 credit hours is going to be half time. Now Scott, though, on the other hand, he begins attendance on August the 15th with 6 credit hours, but adds 2 courses for an additional 6 credits on 9/1 after the Pell recalculation date, right? Subsequently, he drops all courses, though, on October the 15th. Which came first? Well, the Pell recalculation date came first. Obviously, the Pell recalculation date came before he was able to add those 2 classes. It makes sense. Scott is still only going to get half-time Pell, okay? All right. Now, this is one that I think a lot of you probably have never become aware of. This came as a result of my having many discussions with PLI, okay, on this issue. So this is what I like to call not to come up with a new definition, but it's what I like to call a post-Pell recalculation date enrollment start, right? So the idea is here, if I have a program that is offered in modules, and let's say I have a single fixed PRD, Pell recalculation date, but my students are able to start in any one of those modules thereafter, right? Now, in this case, you're saying, let's say I have a student, my Pell recalculation date maybe is September the 15th because I start on September the 1. But I have a module start date maybe around October the 15th because I do that. My students can start anytime they want to, but they don't enroll, right, in that module until after the Pell recalculation date has passed. Do you follow me so far? So what do I do? Does that mean, hold on, my Pell recalculation date has passed? That's not cool. Does that mean my student doesn't get any money? So what we say is, no, you must go ahead and use the latter of the two, okay? I must use, whether it be my enrollment start, my enrollment, when my student enrolls. If that occurs after my PRD, I use that. If my PRD occurs after my enrollment, then I must use the PRD. So it's always the latter of the two as opposed to like withdrawals. It's the earlier of the two. I know, right? It's just words. Let's see how it plays out. Let's flesh it out. Again, Crystal Clear College, right? They have a fall term. Let's take a look at this. Start of August the 15th with the Pell recalculation date of August the 30th. Now, in addition, so we know, to full-length courses, full term length courses, they also have modules within the term. Now, Paul, as an example, Paul does not begin attendance at the start of the term. Do you see that? He didn't enroll yet. But on 9/15, he wants to enroll in 2 modules. Now, he enrolls on September 15th. Which is later, the PRD or the enrollment? the enrollment. So I'm going to take the enrollment that occurs, because that's the latter of the two. He enrolls in 2 modules to start on 10-1. So I am indeed going to go ahead and take that into consideration. I get to do that. So Paul does indeed get half-time status. Now, notice that this is an initial calculation, okay? So if Paul then subsequently after that decides to add another one, that's okay. You don't get that, okay? Because now we're past the PRD, but we get to take that into consideration. You see that? Remember, it's always a letter or two, because I'm going to throw you for a loop, I promise. Here we have same thing, same exact scenario, but in this case, Nancy begins on August 15th with 6 credit hours, but decides to enroll in a Module 3 course on 10-1. Hold on. When was she enrolled? Was she enrolled prior to the PRD? She was. So in this case, am I going to take the enrollment status of the PRD or the enrollment status of a later enrollment date? Yeah, I'm going to take the PRD because the PRD happens after the enrollment, okay? It's the latter of the two. See, because she decides to enroll in a 3-module course on 10-1, I don't care, right? Because she was already enrolled way back then prior to the PRD, so I don't get to add that. So in this case, I'm going to use the Pell recalculation date, and so in that case, she's still going to be 6 credit hours. Do you see that? Good. All right. Now, I know you have a lot. I see that. Talking to each other. It's okay. Do that. It's fun. Come talk to me afterwards. Look for me at Ask-A-Fed. Ask for me specifically. There's probably 2 others who understand this to this extent, okay, over at the Ask-A-Fed. Myself and David Bartnicki. I'm going to throw his name out there, and Kevin Campbell. Okay, but you can ask for either 3 of us when you go to the Ask-A-Fed. If you can't get me outside, I'll wait as long as you want. But if you don't want to do that, meet me at the Ask-A-Fed. I'm not done, though. Sorry. Let's talk about Pell recalculation dates for modules. Now, I did give you some examples with modules, but that was with a single fixed date. So what am I talking about? Well, let's be clear. Just so you know, it is indeed acceptable for a school to assign a Pell recalculation date to each module within a term, right? Because some of you have modules and you say, listen, maybe I want them to be able to add a module and receive Pell Grant funds for that additional module later on, and that's a beautiful thing, but let's be clear, this Pell recalculation date cuts both ways, and you'll see how in just a little bit, okay? But let's keep in mind, when I am going to assign a Pell recalculation date to each module within a term, the PRD is activated only in the event the student begins attendance in that assigned module. Notice that term, activated. Now, if the student does not begin attendance, I don't care if they're scheduled to begin attendance, but they don't begin attendance, right, in an assigned module, the school should use the latest activated Pell recalculation date that has been activated, because it looks as though we have multiple, but let's be clear, there was really only one Pell recalculation date, and that is the last Pell recalculation date that becomes activated, and that's the one I'm going to use. You know why? It's that last one, and this one will be shocking to many of you, so let it sink in. And that is when a Pell recalculation date is activated, I don't care if it has a relationship with the module, right? It is for all courses that have been added and dropped up to that new Pell recalculation date, up to that activated Pell recalculation date when determining enrollment status. Okay, this will be fun to go through some examples. Because I drew pictures, that's why. Now, I like this picture because if you take a look at it, you can see here that I have Crystal Clear College, and you see that they have a term start date at the top there, August 15, ends on 12/15. But notice that they went ahead and they assigned a Pell recalculation date, one that's associated with Module 1 on August the 22nd, about 1 week into that Module 1. One that is associated with full-term courses, and one that is associated with the Module 2. Now remember, it's just when a student begins attendance, that's when that Pell recalculation date is going to become activated in those associated courses, okay? So that's the layout so far. Let's look at some students and what happens to them. Now, Jesse, as an example, is scheduled to attend, now follow me along here, with 6 credit hours in the full-term courses. 3 credits in Module 1, as well as 3 credits in Module 2. So far up front, the student is a full-time student, okay? But hold on, right? He drops a full-term course, 3 credit hours, on 9/5. Do you see that, where that occurs? On September the 5th, okay? And the Mod 2 course on 10/20. So notice what he did. He continued enrollment all the way through, began attendance in Module 2, but withdrew from Module 2 on 10/20. Now, did he activate that Pell recalculation date in Module 2? He did, because he began attendance in Module 2. So what I do is I now have to use a Pell recalculation date of 10/23 because he activated that because he began class. He began attendance in a Module 2 class, even though he withdrew prior to the Pell recalculation date. Do you see what happened here, though? He did indeed drop 1 full-term course, even though it was after the second PRD. You see that? I don't care. A PRD is a PRD. It doesn't only relate to module courses. So I have to take into consideration all the courses that he has dropped and added up to that 10/23 Pell recalculation date that has been activated, and that is the last one. And so that makes sense now, right? That Jesse is only a half-time. I'm going to do some recalculating, am I not? Yes. Yeah, okay. Let's take a look at Michelle. Now, Michelle is scheduled to attend 6 credit hours in a full-term course. Same thing, 3 credit hours in Mod 1 and 3 credit hours in Mod 2. Full-time, just like I said at the very beginning. But in this case, she drops the full-term course, right, 3 credits on 9/5. Look at that. And never begins attendance in Module 2. So what happens here? Because Michelle never began attendance in a Module 2 course, was my 10/23 Pell recalculation date activated? It was not. So what do I need to do? I need to go to my latest activated Pell recalculation date, which was September the 1st. Do you see that? But notice he didn't drop that 3 credit hours for the full-term course until September 5. I get to count that one, don't I? But guess what? Because she never began attendance, do I get to count in the Module 2 course, do I get to count those credit hours? I don't, because she never began attendance. Remember, we take that away. So that's why Michelle is at 3/4 time Pell in this example. Okay? Let it sink in. Now, I know that I have given you all the moving parts because I have schools say, well, what happens with this and what happens with that? And trust me, that's where we go back and forth and said, this is the rule, let's play all the parts. And there's not one example where if we take all the rules into consideration where we cannot have a solution. But that's okay. That's why I'm still going to take your questions after we're all done. I get it, okay? But what about adds, drops? Because we've been talking a lot about Pell. What about adds, drops, and direct loans? Well, I said you cannot use your census date to determine the enrollment status. So what do I do? Well, let's be clear first up front. Again, one more time, Pell recalculation dates, or as you like to call them, census dates, have no relevance, none, when determining enrollment status for direct loans. Okay, so for direct loans, just keep in mind that the school must determine eligibility at the time of disbursement or before disbursement. Okay? An otherwise eligible student must be enrolled at least half-time. Now, we know that at the time of the disbursement, and keep in mind, now this is a big one, it is important for the school to have a process to verify enrollment status prior to disbursement. Now, I get it, you're not required to take attendance, but notice I'm not asking you to take attendance, I'm asking you to verify enrollment status, although that does play a role in some extent, making sure they actually begin attendance for those classes in which they're enrolled. You'll see that later on. Okay. Now, by the way, this is really for all Title IV aid, other than Pell, because all Title IV aid, it's determining what the student's enrollment status is at the time of disbursement. Okay. That helps you determine how much aid they're going to receive, if that's the case, if it's enrollment status type aid. Okay. Just so make sure, the other rule is just make sure that the student actually began attendance for those classes for which they're enrolled. Okay, and that's the other determining factor. When you get those 2 things, you're golden. Okay, it's that simple. Now, with that in mind, what about early disbursements? Because I get a lot of schools that get confused about early disbursements, and this is kind of interesting here, right? Let's say I have an early disbursement, right? You schools, you understand that, you term-based schools especially understand that I can definitely, or even non-term, I can definitely disperse funds up to 10 days prior to the enrollment start date, right? Now, the key here is, remember, I'm not looking for a 10, I'm looking for what the student is enrolled in, okay? So if I'm going to do an early disbursement, let's say I have a student who is enrolled half-time, but hold on, and that's okay. We go ahead and we make the disbursement for half-time. We make the disbursement because it's an early disbursement before they begin attendance. But my student begins attendance. They don't begin attendance in one of the classes. Oh, that's fine, but I've already dispersed the money. My student did not establish half-time eligibility, did they? But we don't care. This is where we don't care. See? It's a good we don't care. Because if the student begins attendance as a less than half-time, the disbursement, yay, can be kept. Okay, and the student gets to repay that in accordance with the terms and conditions of the promissory note. All right, subsequent disbursements, though, right, within that term cannot be made because they're now less than half-time. So that's not so bad. Now notice, though, my student was at least half-time. They did begin attendance in at least one class. Your next question, well, hold on, I dispersed the money, early disbursement, but they didn't begin attendance in any of my classes. Now this is really cool because I got to tell you, I didn't have to do any thinking. I just cheated and pulled verbatim from the FSA handbook as to exactly what it says. I didn't have to have a conversation with other people, okay? And this is what it says. If I have an early disbursement but my student never begins attendance, the school must return any direct loan funds credited to the student's account. Maybe, those allowable charges that you're entitled to receive. Well, I'm going to return those back because my student didn't begin attendance. For any remaining loan funds, such as a credit balance that may have been dispersed to the student, the school must notify the appropriate loan servicer because what? They're not eligible for this money. They don't get to pay in accordance with the terms and conditions of the loan. They didn't earn a dime of it. You got it? Not eligible. Okay? It's really that simple. Direct loans are that simple, okay? We're halfway through now. All right. Let's talk about withdrawals. And I know this is a big issue too, and I always spend a lot of time talking to schools, especially not required to take attendance on this issue, because this is where we hit you the most, right? On the program reviews and audits. It really is. Well, not the most, but you're in the top 10. First, let's talk about withdrawals. What is a withdrawal, right? And I know we're going to lay down some groundwork here. In the case of a program that is measured in credit hours, right, the student does not complete all the days in the payment period or period of enrollment that the school was scheduled to complete. So it's simple, right? My student, the idea behind Title IV A is my student earns A through attendance, okay? So when they withdraw, right, they're no longer eligible for that full amount, and so we have to go ahead and do a calculation. So it's when they don't complete the number of days, they haven't earned all of that aid. Since I kicked out all the clock hour schools, all right, maybe some of you do a combination thereof, so let's talk about it anyway, okay? In the case of clock hours, really simple. I have a payment period, and the student does not complete all the clock hours and weeks within that payment period or period of enrollment. You're allowed to do that as well. Then, of course, the student is withdrawn. Okay, and they haven't earned all the aid that was dispersed for that payment period. Okay, so that's a withdrawal. We need to calculate a return for that. Now, some things you need to consider, though, right? Especially you schools with modules, and if you have modules within a non-term environment or a non-standard term environment, we added one extra rule just to make it fun for you. Because I may have a student who withdraws within a module, and they say, that's okay, I'm going to come back, and we say that's great. But we have to count the number of days from the end of that module to the time they're going to begin attendance again. And if it's more than 45 days, we don't care. Again, it is a withdrawal. We must do an R2T4 calculation. Okay? It is a withdrawal if it's more than 45 days. Now, some things I want to point out to you. I'm going to say this word for word. If a student ceases attendance, right, basically drops or withdraws from all of his or her Title IV eligible courses, I'm going to remind us, in a payment period or period of enrollment, the student is considered a withdrawal. even if the student is enrolled in non-Title IV courses. Now, what's interesting about that, I won't go into great detail, but for enrollment reporting purposes, that's not the case. But for Title IV purposes, it is indeed the case. You must withdraw them and do your R2T4 calculation, okay? Okay, and I like to say this just for fun, just to remind you, which is the goal of the return provisions is to identify the date that most accurately reflects the point when a student ceases attendance, not the date that will maximize federal student aid to the institution of student, right? Let me give you an example. Some of us have instructors that we say, hey, could you give us the best estimate if we notice that it's past the 60, if it's the 50% point, the midpoint, and you say, you know what, it would be nice if we got something from the instructor. They gave us the best estimate as to maybe they withdrew. Let's hope that it's after the 60% point. But you don't do the same thing for the student that maybe you suspect they last attended before the 50% point. You see? So if you're going to do something like that, and I'm going to encourage you to make sure you use an academically related activity, that you do it consistently, not just to your benefit or the student's benefit. Okay? Yay. Good. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about this short section about schools that are required to take attendance and who they are. This will be short. Right? Now, I'm required to take attendance only in the event that I have an outside entity, such as an accrediting agency or a state that requires me to offer this particular program, okay, in such a way that we are required to take attendance, right? It may be the type of program that, for instance, requires a certain amount of, requires licensure, but requires my student has so many contact hours, and so there's no other way for me to do it other than to do it this way, to take attendance. Okay? It also may be that I have an institution that, despite the fact that nobody from the outside requires it, but because you have administrators that say, this is how we roll, they're going to require all of your instructors, and there are some of you out there in this room right now. It may not be required from a state or accrediting agency or anybody else, but you just do it that way. Well, guess what? You just became a school that is required to take attendance, and you must abide by these rules I'm going to share with you. Not only this, but also data determination rules that I'll get to later on, which is really fun for you if you're not used to doing it that way. So keep that in mind. Now, the thing about a school that's required to take attendance, it's really simple, actually. It's very simple. Because I'm taking attendance, guess what I use to determine my last date of attendance? My attendance records. That's my withdrawal date is the last date of attendance in accordance with my attendance records. That's it. It's that simple. We're done. You see the beauty in that? Good. So let's talk about schools that are not required to take attendance. Trust me, this will not be as short as the previous one. Now, schools that are not required to take attendance, right? These are schools that are not required to take attendance by any outside agency, right? And let's be fair, most credit hour schools fall in this category where they're not required to take attendance, and making sure, of course, that you're not one of these schools that have some sort of formal policy that your instructors do it anyway, okay? Because if that's the case, you are then, again, a school that's required to take attendance. So I have a feeling that's a very, very, very large portion of you, if not all of you here, that fall into this category, and that's why you're here for this session and why you haven't walked out yet. Now, I like to do a certain flow. I love this topic because once I go through a flow, which, let's be fair, in Volume 5, it is all over the place and you're jumping around in 50 different places to find it in Volume 5 as to how this works. I've created a flow for you that I hope will make sense. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how is it, where is it, what is it that occurs where I have a very specific date. So I'm going to go through those instances first. Okay, the first one is an official notification. Now you have your own official withdrawal process that you want your students to go through, right? Yay. And we love it when they do it, but it doesn't always happen. And they go through your official withdrawal process. Now, this is where things are getting messed up, right? Because the truth is, the date is not with the student. You have this beautiful little form that your student fills out, and they say, well, I'm going to withdraw on this date, and they give that, oh, that's good. We're going to use the date that this, is the student allowed to self-certify when their withdrawal date is, when you don't take attendance? No, so please don't do that. Tell your registrar's office, please don't do that. It's the date the student begins the withdrawal process. We don't care what they put on the form. Oh, it's a I love you, don't care, okay? But let's be clear, it is the date they begin the process. And this is where schools get hit a lot, because somebody's not listening in the office that's telling you that this is when it needs to be. Okay? And we'll hit you. We'll give you a liability for it. Assess a liability for it. All right. Now, you may, though, use a last day of attendance. However, if documentation is provided that corresponds to an academically related activity. And I'll talk about that later on. So I have an official, my student, they begin the process this date. I may, though, if I do indeed have, maybe an assignment was turned in the following week, which is an academically related activity, I'm not required to, I may use that as my withdrawal date. Okay? See the difference? Then we have those students that otherwise provide notification. These are the ones that say, you know what, your 10-step process is killing me. I'm just going to let you know by email I'm not going to be there anymore. Guess what? That works too. Okay, for us, we call it an otherwise provides notification. They didn't go through your process, but maybe they either told you in person or they sent you an email or whatever the case may be and saying, I'm not showing up anymore. Again, the withdrawal date is the day the school receives the notification from the student. Not what they tell you, not what they provide in writing, that sort of thing. Okay? Now keep in mind that if they provide this to you orally, that's fine, that you ask them to provide something in writing, but they're not required to. Okay? Just make sure that you document it, you document that they told you this and who it was that they told it to and so on and so forth. And that's the date that they provide that notification is indeed a very hard date of your withdrawal date. Okay? Good. Now, let's shift out of that. There are also instances in which they're beyond my students' control, in which they're no longer able to attend anymore. Maybe it's an illness. Maybe they got into an accident or whatever the case may be, or a family member died and they just couldn't carry on anymore. I get it. So it can be the date the circumstance occurred. It can be the date the circumstance occurred if you wanted to do that. Now, in the event that it is beyond their control because, well, we suspended you. It is beyond your control because we're suspending you. We're terminating your enrollment because of all the horrible things you did as a student. Okay? Not horrible, but you get it. Broke the rules, maybe. I don't know. But it's the date the student, it's the date the school terminates. Okay? That's the date that you're going to use for the withdrawal date. That's simple. Now, the Department of Education, in its infinite wisdom, came to the very quick conclusion that a student, once they die, it is very difficult for them to continue attendance at your school. Therefore, we've concluded, with a lot of research, the withdrawal date can be no later than the date of the student's death. You see that? You laugh, but we want to make sure you understand. Now, I do want to say that there's an entire appendices, okay, in Volume 5 that's dedicated to this, and I'm just keeping it simple for right now, but you get the idea, okay? I prefer that you go look at the appendices depending upon the circumstance at your school as to which date you should use. But have you noticed so far that I've come up with some very specific dates? Good. Because if I don't have those instances that occur, guess what I do? Guess what I automatically default to? My midpoint. My midpoint. In other words, my student didn't provide notification, didn't go through the process, no incident, I didn't expel them, none of that. We know they withdrew, we just don't know when. Automatic default, midpoint. So that's the flow. Say, I know when they did withdraw, but if I don't, it's the midpoint. However, I may, for either one of these instances, use an academically related activity instead of these first two environments. You see where I'm going with this? You see the flow that I'm using here? Either I know it or I don't, so I go to my midpoint, but let's maybe use an academically related activity. I may do that if I so choose. If I believe it to be a more accurate reflection of the withdrawal date, just make sure that you document what the academic related activity is, right, and the student's attendance at that activity, if you're going to do that. So what is an academically related activity? Well, let's give you some examples. right? Makes sense. If I do happen to have that one rogue instructor, and by the way, you're not a school that's required to take attendance. If you just have one instructor that just likes to roll that way, regardless of what your school says, that's okay. You're not a school that's required to take attendance for that one rogue. But if they take attendance, you're certainly welcome. You may use those attendance records for the last day of attendance. Do not ask them to give a best guess. Submitting an academic assignment makes sense. They turned it in this date. Let's use this as an academic-related activity. Taking an exam, studying in a study group, participating in online discussion, participating in an online discussion, or initiating contact with a faculty member. So you get an idea to ask a question, right, about a course in which they're currently enrolled in. You get the idea. That's an academic. You can use those. You may use those. Let's be clear, you're not required to use those. But if you're going to use them, please, let's make sure we use them consistently, not just to your advantage. Okay? Good. What is it not, right? We know you have students who love living in your housing, but they don't like attending class. And they love your meal plans. I don't care how much they love the food there. It doesn't matter. It does not constitute an attendance. Okay? Same thing. I want to point this out. Online courses, it does not mean they just log in. You know, there's no active participation because students think they're gaming the system, right? So, also, this used to be one, right, prior to the new program integrity rules that we also love, but it's no longer an academically related activity, which is participating in academic counseling or advisement, all right? So that doesn't count. All right, so again, those are things that you may use. Did you see the flow that we used here? Beautiful. I'm so happy. Here's something else I want to bring up, and this may be something you end up coming and talk to me and asking me a lot of questions about, because I always do get these questions. What if I have a student who fails to earn a passing grade in all of their courses? Let's be clear, in all of their courses, right? Now, if that happens, right, if a student receives, in the event, right, that they receive they fail every single one of their courses, you must assume that the student withdrew. You don't know when it happened, so what am I going to do as a default? Midpoint. Unless you can come up with an academically related activity for just one of those classes that would suggest that they completed just one of those classes. And that's all I need, right? It's just one class, right? It's an F that they earned it, okay? Because they attended throughout the entire class. They just didn't do well. And all I need is just one of those classes, or just have passed one of those classes, and you're allowed to assume that the student did not withdraw, and you're golden, okay? I do want to talk about data determination. I know you know what it is. Well, no, I don't want to make that assumption. A data determination, let's be clear, is not the same as a withdrawal date, right? It is exactly what it sounds like. It is the date the school becomes aware that the student ceased attendance. Okay, so that can be very different from the day they actually withdrew, right? Because we can become aware that the student withdrew for you schools not required to take attendance, right, up to 30 days after the payment period or term has ended. That's just a beautiful thing, right? It's not the same as the withdrawal date. And it gives you some time. And why is the date of determination so significant? It's significant because we don't start counting the number of days in which we have to meet deadlines to do certain things, such as conducting an R2 T4 calculation. You know, we don't do that starting from the withdrawal date. We do that starting from the date of determination, and that's why the date of determination is so significantly important, okay? Now, for a student who does indeed provide notification, though, of a withdrawal to the institution, I'm going to provide notification, I'm withdrawing, okay? Notice this, the date of determination is the later the student's withdrawal date or the date of notification of withdrawal. And all they're saying here is, maybe I notify you today, and normally I said, hey, that's going to be your withdrawal date, but what if you have an academically related activity that shows that they actually did indeed withdraw next week? So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my date of determination is at least the later of the two so that I have time to conduct the processing, okay? Good. Now, remember how I told you there may be some of you schools that are not typically required to take attendance, but, well, because maybe your school requires your instructors to do it that way anyway. or whatever the instance may be, guess what? I want to remind you, you may be used to waiting until up to 30 days after the term ends. That's not the case if you're required to take attendance, even for a single student. For maybe you receive a contract to receive aid where you say, I'm going to go ahead and take attendance for the student in order to receive this aid for the student. Guess what? You're a school that's required to take attendance for that one student. And this applies. And that means that I'm taking attendance for that student. And so guess what my date of determination is? It's only up to 14 days after the withdrawal date. You see how that can become a problem if I'm not required to take attendance normally and I'm not paying attention? Maybe they withdraw day 5. That means on day 29, I better have a date of determination. I start counting down 30 days before that R2T4 calculation has to be done, and that may be before the whole term is over. You get the point here? So pay close attention to that. And of course, as I indicated earlier, if I'm a school that's not required to take attendance, then I have up to 30 days after the end of the payment period, end of the academic year, or the educational program, whichever comes first, okay? Now, again, I know you've seen this 100 times. Just a reminder, what are some of the deadlines that I'm responsible for after the date of determination? I have 30 days, in other words, after the date of determination to, for instance, complete the R2T4 calculation. We're all very much aware of that, right? At the same time, at the end of those 30 days, I better be ready to notify the student if there's an overpayment. So let's try not to do it all on the same day, okay? Same thing, post-withdrawal disbursement. And this is the one where it kills us the most because I don't have communication between maybe my financial aid office and my business office. It's the 45 days from the date of determination because I don't have a system that's tracking those 45 days to return Title IV aid back to us. Right? It's a big problem, okay? A lot of schools miss it because they don't have a system that tracks it. Just a thought. Maybe your business office can do the R2T4 calculations. I know you like that one. Okay, and just one more reminder about the deadlines. You have 180 days from the date of disbursements when it pertains to direct loan funds to actually to conduct a post-withdrawal disbursement if the student is indeed eligible for it. Okay? Good. All right, let's talk about some enrollment reporting reminders. Let's be clear about one thing up front here. I'm not the NSLDS guy. I'm a regulation guy, okay? I do want to point out that if you're really looking for the nuts and bolts one more time, session number 9 does a wonderful job at that. They'll give you all the answers you need and more than you want, okay, on NSLDS enrollment reporting, but I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about this on some basic level as a reminder to you, okay? And that is that schools, just as a reminder, remember, you have to schedule a roster file to be sent to you by NSLDS. A minimum of every 60 days. You can say every 30 days and have it come to you every 30 days. Just keep that in mind. But understand that once you receive an enrollment roster file, you must certify any enrollment status changes or within 15 days of receiving that roster file. Now, this is a beautiful thing. If you'll remember, it used to be that you had 30 days from the time that you became aware of an enrollment status change before you certified that change. But now with these enrollment roster files, if you have 45 days before you know it's coming in, you're allowed to wait for the enrollment roster file to come in, and then you have 15 days after that to certify it. So it's a beautiful thing. Nothing to get upset about. It's actually a good thing that we're doing these, okay? Now, if you're one of those schools that provides a response, certifying your responses via a batch file, just keep in mind that when you submit a batch file, just like we like to do with any batch files, we like to send back edit responses. Just know that you have 10 days to fix and respond to those edit responses the NSLDS will send to you, okay, to correct them. Okay, again, just a reminder, it's not like the old days, is it? Many more status codes these days than what it used to be. Just a quick throw up there, just as a reminder. Again, just want to encourage you to go to that NSLDS enrollment reporting session and get all the finer details. But yeah, just like that 3/4 time wasn't always there, was it? You know, so a lot of new things that we have to include in there as a part of the enrollment reporting, just as a reminder of some of the codes. Now, this is one slide that I wanted to point out to you that I think some financial aid administrators were not aware of. Now, sure, we know that we have 15 days from the time that we receive that NSLDS roster file for us to go ahead and provide to certify any changes that have actually occurred. But if we reach the 22nd day and we don't receive a response back from you, notice it's 7 days after you're required to get it done, note that we will send you this wonderful notification. Okay, it's called a late report notification. And we not only send it to your enrollment reporting contact that you list on NSLDS or your primary contact, but look at this, pay close attention. We send it to your CEO and campus presidents. And we remind your CEO and campus president, by the way, any failure to comply with this enrollment reporting requirement can result in loss of Title IV aid eligibility. You think it might be important to know that they're actually receiving that? Yeah, because they don't want to lose that, do they? Good. Okay. Thank you so far. Let's point out some resources. I did want to include in here where we do. Now, there are some things that you may not find in the handbook. You're only going to get it here, which is why I'm assuming we have a long line out the door. But I have provided for you all the resources, I believe, in the handbook that are most helpful for you, as well as some regulations that I think are significantly important for you to review to make sure you understand things and you can justify what you're doing back in the office. None of that contradicts what I shared with you today. That said, I'm certainly willing to take questions. I see some people leaving. You're welcome to ask questions out loud or certainly line up here. We have a period of time. And for those I'm not able to get to, we'll step outside. But it looks like they're not going to come up to the mic. Don't forget, you have my email address. Again, there's only a select few of us. I do encourage you to please, by all means, email me if you can't see me at AskAFed. Understand that I'm a trainer. I'm on the road quite a bit, though. Okay? Otherwise, thank you so much.